This video has been sponsored by Squarespace. Adaptations are an inescapable part of the entertainment industry these days. Whether it's book-to-screen films, prequels, sequels, franchises, or reboots, almost all of the popular things that we've seen lately have been adaptations of something else. And I see plenty of people complaining about that fact, wondering why we can't make anything original nowadays. But I see less people discussing what that actually means. What is originality, and are adaptations necessarily a violation of originality? And how can we discuss and critique adaptations in a nuanced and constructive way whilst being in an echo chamber that often uses the term adaptation as inherently derogatory? For better or for worse, adaptations as a form of storytelling aren't going anywhere, so today I want to sit down and discuss a couple of specific examples, their strengths and their weaknesses, to try and figure out how we can and should critique adaptation. Don't worry, I even made a fun diagram. Just for the record, I will be spoiling various plot points from all four of these pieces of media, from the source material as well as from the adaptation. So if you'd like to avoid those spoilers, I will be putting a timestamp up here when I start talking about a new piece of media, so you can avoid that if you'd like. But you know what you're not going to want to avoid? A website from this video's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website building platform that's going to help you stand out and succeed online. Squarespace makes sure that your website is going to get discovered fast using their integrated SEO tools. Every one of their websites is optimized to be indexed with meta descriptions, an auto-generated sitemap, and more. All the kind of things that you need to show up in search engines and bring in more customers. And with Squarespace's email campaigns feature, you're going to be able to engage clients, promote your services, and grow your business. You can stay connected and drive growth while saving yourself time using their automated emails, and you can seamlessly integrate your products into those emails. And with Squarespace, it is so easy to monetize what you make. You can sell access to online courses, blogs, videos, and memberships. All you have to do is set the price and choose between charging a one-time fee or a subscription. It couldn't be easier. If you're interested in refreshing an existing brand or building an entirely new one, Squarespace is the place to do it. All you have to do is head down to squarespace.com for a completely free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/JessOfTheShire to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thanks so much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel, and thanks to all of you for checking out my sponsors. Let's start out with what tends to get the most clicks online, the ever-infamous bad adaptation. We've all clicked on those clickbait articles discussing an unfaithful adaptation, or watched a video essay dismantling a book-to-movie flop. I, too, have fallen into this trap before. It's just how the internet works. Negativity tends to get clicks. But in my opinion, a lot of these stories fail not just because they're an unfaithful adaptation, but because they're just badly told stories. I think one of the best examples of this is Peter Jackson's Hobbit trilogy. Despite raking in money at the box office, these movies are famously not good. And to be completely fair to them, the odds were stacked against them from the very beginning. After the widespread popularity of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings adaptations, an adaptation of The Hobbit, Tolkien's other famous work, seemed inevitable. As early as 2007, Peter Jackson was named as the executive producer of this project, but it was stuck in limbo for years after. In 2008, pre-production began with Guillermo del Toro as director, but by 2010 the movies were still being delayed further and further, and del Toro dropped out of the production. With no director, Peter Jackson went from being executive producer to reluctantly being the director, and they had to scramble to prepare for shooting. Peter Jackson's reluctance aside, it didn't seem like an altogether bad idea to have the Hobbit adaptation be created by many of the same team members that had worked on The Lord of the Rings in the same country with the same director. The Lord of the Rings were good movies, and they were good adaptations. They're generally regarded, despite some changes being made and despite some people not liking the movies, as the best that any director could have done, with books that are kind of impossible to adapt 100% faithfully. The Hobbit movies have not garnered that kind of praise. So, what went wrong? The Lord of the Rings films had three particular things that the Hobbit movies did not. The first thing was time. Pre-production on the Lord of the Rings films was well over 2 years of intensive work from some of the best minds in fantasy fiction. They were making costumes, working on makeup, designing sets, drawing art. For The Hobbit, Peter Jackson and his team had less than a year. Yes, Del Toro had been working on pre-production for a little while, but with a new director, they needed to have a new artistic vision. They weren't making a Del Toro film, they were making a Peter Jackson film. And so they had to completely redo and scrap a lot of what he had already been working on. The second thing that The Lord of the Rings had over the Hobbit films is actually a limitation. And that is the fact that CGI technology was not advanced enough to be used as a crutch. In the year 2000, digital effects generally didn't look great, and so the Lord of the Rings films had to be very conservative with the graphics that they used, and what they did need had to be done very well. Because they couldn't just make up scenery and monsters and action sequences in post, they had to rely heavily on practical effects. Forced perspective, puppets, makeup, clever lighting, on-scene shooting, and because of this, the CGI in The Lord of the Rings still manages to look shockingly decent, even 20 years later. The Hobbit films, due to advancements in the technology, and because of the limited time that they had to prepare things like practical effects and makeup and scenery, they had to rely on CGI to fill in a lot of the gaps. And when that much CGI is being used, no matter how well it's done for the time in which it is made, it's never going to age particularly well. A lot of action sequences in the trilogy come out looking video gamey. The actors struggled to perform to tennis balls in all green rooms, and the plot often hinges on CGI moments that at best look wonky, and at worst break the established rules and physics of the world. The third thing that the Lord of the Rings trilogy had going for it that The Hobbit did not was another limitation: budget. The Lord of the Rings trilogy was working with a little bit over $280 million for all three movies. The Hobbit films had over $700 million. And even adjusted for inflation, that's a lot more money. And as was the case with limitations in CGI, it turns out that necessity is the mother of invention. In the Lord of the Rings trilogy, beyond just creative workarounds, the tight budget also helped restrain some of Peter Jackson's more radical ideas. For example, at the end of The Fellowship of the Ring, he wanted to include a whitewater rapids chase action sequence akin to the ever-infamous barrel scene from the Hobbit movies, but he was unable to due to budgetary constraints. While, as an artist of sorts, I would certainly never advocate for paying artists less money, I will say that the limitations, both budgetary and technological, that were imposed on The Lord of the Rings grounded those films in a way that the Hobbit movies sorely could have used. But the Hobbit films were always going to be impossible to pull off perfectly for the mere fact that the Lord of the Rings films came first. Now, to his credit, Peter Jackson did originally, before the Lord of the Rings, approach studios trying to get the Hobbit movies made before the Lord of the Rings films were made, but studios thought that the Lord of the Rings would sell better. So it was that the Lord of the Rings came out first, and with the same team making these movies, comparison between The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings was going to be inevitable. The Hobbit was going to be viewed as a prequel to the Lord of the Rings, something that it very fundamentally was originally not. The Hobbit was originally not intended to be connected to the larger legendarium of Tolkien's world at all. It was not part of the universe that the Lord of the Rings would be a part of. This is to the point where the ring that Bilbo finds, the One Ring as it would become, is originally just a magical ring in the first edition of The Hobbit. This story is not a big, dramatic fantasy epic of the scope and scale of The Lord of the Rings. It is an episodic, musical children's adventure that manages to grow into a rich and fulfilling conclusion. This means that in The Hobbit, there are a lot of tropes, themes, and characters that Tolkien would kind of try out for size in that book before he brought them to fulfillment in The Lord of the Rings. This is why Bard in The Hobbit, the secret heir of the kingdom, is basically just an Aragorn light. This is why Bilbo is kind of a proto-version of both Frodo, Sam, and the other hobbits. This is why Gandalf is nearly unrecognizable in The Hobbit compared to the character that he becomes in The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien wrote The Hobbit for a young audience, and then 16 years later, he wrote The Lord of the Rings to be read by that audience who had now grown up. This is not meant to be an insult on the quality of The Hobbit. It does exactly what it is trying to do, but it does mean that when you put The Lord of the Rings head-to-head with The Hobbit will seem kind of frivolous in comparison. By putting the Hobbit films out after the Lord of the Rings films, they flipped that original publishing order, where you can see the very obvious growth from one story to the next, on its head. The tone of The Hobbit just seems too light and carefree when you know what is coming in some 60 or 70 years. Bard seems like a cheap imitation of a really good character, rather than just the archetypal character who is going to be filled in by a later, more advanced story. The children who had grown up watching the Lord of the Rings films were now having a kids' movie dumped into their now adult laps. The shadow of the Lord of the Rings films affected the Hobbit movies in a lot of ways, but I think that one of the most damaging was the fact that the Lord of the Rings films was one of the reasons that pushed the Hobbit movies into being made into a trilogy. Now, there are a lot of reasons that this choice was made. There's just the fact that 3 theatrical releases makes more money than 2, and the concept of splitting a book into a bunch of different movies was pretty popular at the time, but I do think that this comparison was a major part of that. The Lord of the Rings movies had been a trilogy, and so for the sake of symmetry, the Hobbit movies should also be a trilogy. And this trilogizing had a hugely harmful effect on the basic quality of the Hobbit films. The original plan was to make 2 films out of the Hobbit book. They did all of their principal photography, anticipating that they were shooting for 2 films. The original script was 2 films. The choice to turn the movies into 3 films instead came after principal photography, and so all of the reshuffling, reordering, and rewriting had to be done largely through different shoots, extra shoots, and through green screen. And rest assured, restructuring and reshuffling was required. After all, a trilogy isn't just one really long story conveniently snipped into 3 separate places. A good trilogy, at least, should be 3 separate stories that can stand on their own, but work together to tell a larger, overarching story. This meant that each of these 3 now Hobbit movies needed to have their own beginning, middle, and ends. This meant that they had to punch up the escape from the Misty Mountains to conclude the first movie, they had to insert a very zany Smaug chase action sequence in the second film, and they had to downplay the insane barrel chase sequence in the middle of film 2 because that was formerly the end of movie 1 in the original plan. To bulk up the runtime, filler material had to be made up or pulled from the appendices of Tolkien's other works, and while some of it is legitimately fun to see on screen as a Tolkien fan, it pulls attention away from the simple, driven plot that made The Hobbit so beloved in the first place. While quite necessary, this reshuffling seriously hurt the quality of the films. They rush through some parts and plod through others, even through high-paced action sequences. And I think that this restructuring, along with some other Hollywood buffoonery, really flattened out the arcs of a lot of the characters. This can especially be seen in the case of Bilbo, who is thrust into a much more overtly heroic role much earlier than he ever was in the book. The Bilbo of the books is a true everyman hero, the kind of guy that carries a sword around for the effect, but rarely, if ever, uses it. The Bilbo of the movies is constantly using his sword. In fact, by the end of the first film, he is leading the charge into battle when even the other war-hardened dwarves are too scared to. Tolkien lets this character truly grow organically. these small acts of bravery compounding upon themselves as his self-confidence grows, until, at the end of the Battle of the Five Armies, he is able to use his particular kind of heroism and his diplomacy to broker peace between ancient enemies and save the day in his own small little way. In the Hobbit films, Bilbo finds his bravery in the first movie, and then waffles about for 2 films, acting confidently, while kind of saying that he's not confident, before charging into battle with his friends at the end. All of the complexity from Tolkien's original character arc, the everyman character finding his own approach towards heroism, is replaced with a fairly bog-standard Hollywood shy guy to sword-wielding hero archetypal story. In order to serve the high-octane CGI roller coaster ride tempo that these movies adopted, many of the character arcs that Tolkien had originally written were flattened. These movies were well casted and well acted, but the writing doesn't give them the time or space to have a truly growing character arc. But I think the main issue that arises from making The Hobbit a prequel to The Lord of the Rings is tone. The tone of The Hobbit is just considerably lighter than The Lord of the Rings. The characters are silly, they're a little more goofy and incompetent. The ending is far less emotionally fraught than The Lord of the Rings, despite its little bit of drama. But that tonal disparity is very present, and it is actually something that Tolkien recognized and tried to remedy. After the publication and the popularity of The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit underwent numerous revisions, many of them unpublished. From officially publishing a new edition in which the riddles in the dark scene played out to align with The Lord of the Rings, to trying to change around other details, Tolkien never quite let the story of The Hobbit rest, because he felt like it did not appropriately fit The Lord of the Rings. In the 1960s, he even set off on a full rewrite, retelling the story from the perspective of Gandalf and the dwarves, in order to give the story more seriousness and to set it into its general political landscape. But you want to know something? Tolkien discovered that these more dramatic revisions didn't work. The story had to be altered too radically. Bilbo's character ended up looking frivolous and silly unless he was to transform him to a degree where the character would be completely unrecognizable, and within just 3 chapters of that rewrite, Tolkien completely gave up on it, and he decided to just let The Hobbit be what it was. After all, there's nothing wrong with being able to see an author grow from their first major published story to their next. Part of the reason that Peter Jackson and his team gave for all of the changes that they made to the Hobbit films, particularly including material from the appendices and adjusting the tone, they say it's because they were trying to align it for Tolkien's vision of The Hobbit that he had later in his life. And you know what? They did include the material, and they did adjust the tone. And just as Tolkien had learned some 50 years earlier, it made for a worse story. The Hobbit movies don't just suffer from being unfaithful. In fact, in a convoluted way, you could almost argue that they're more faithful to certain ideas that Tolkien had about The Hobbit or whatever. But they're also just bad movies. They over-rely on poorly aged technology, they're overinflated and long for the sake of being long, they don't hold to their own world-building rules, and many of the character arcs are flat. Don't get me wrong, I love these movies. They infected my 12-year-old mind like the bubonic plague. I loved the Lord of the Rings movies, and it was exciting to be back in the world. And I still stand by the fact that the behind the scenes of those movies is worlds better than the actual Hobbit movies. They're so fun to watch, and I highly recommend that people watch them. But my point is that this is an adaptation that fails, not just because it's a bad adaptation, but because in their efforts to make this story something that it is not, they failed to make a good movie. That is why I would like to introduce my diagram for the analysis of adaptation, in which the primary axis is, regardless of whether or not this movie is faithful or unfaithful to the source material, completely regardless of its relation to the source material at all, can it stand on its own as a good movie? The Hobbit, unfortunately, rests on the side of being a not very good movie. But there are some films that, regardless of their relationship to the source material, are very good movies. And I think one of the best examples of that is The Princess Bride. The The Princess Bride is one of those movies that became such a popular cult classic that a lot of people forget it was even an adaptation. But it was, and the original book, written by William Golding, is a very fun, very odd novel. The introductory material introduces us to Bill Goldman, who is kind of like William Goldman, but he's a fictionalized version of William Goldman. He's the fictional supposed author of this book. So he's the typical Hollywood screenwriter sleazebag. And the premise is that as a kid, he was sick, and his dad read him S. Morgenstern's classical historical novel, The Princess Bride. Now, as a father himself, Bill is trying to connect to his son, and so he buys him a copy of the book The Princess Bride by S. Morgenstern. And he's very disappointed when his kid doesn't even read past the first chapter. He loved this story as a kid, so why doesn't his kid like it? Of course, he picks up the book and realizes that it's virtually unrecognizable to the story that his father told him. Far from the dashing, rollicking fairy tale adventure that he remembers, S. Morgenstern's original book is actually a kind of stodgy historical satire filled with chapters on chapters of lists of what people are buying, because that's the kind of thing that Florinese scholars find really interesting. It turns out that Bill's father had only ever told him the best bits of the story, a kind of fairy tale revision summary of the story told originally by S. Morgenstern, who, by the way, is fictional. This is not a real book. But the premise of the book, then, is that trying to reclaim his childhood joy and reconnect to his son, Bill is abridging S. Morgenstern's book. And the book that we get, The Princess Bride, is the abridgment of the original Morgenstern Princess Bride. I feel like I overcomplicated that a lot, but you guys are all smart. I'm sure you figured out what I'm talking about before I did. Bill's character continues to be a present and active voice as the storyteller, through footnotes and through commentary. He's complaining about Morgenstern's tendency to use parentheses when they don't really need to be used. He cuts in to explain that he cut away from a complete chapter of irrelevant cultural exposition that everyone would have found boring. While Bill starts out the story kind of jaded and honestly unlikable, throughout the story he begins to warm up as he slips into the role of fairy tale storyteller. In one of my favorite parts of this novel, the lovers of the story, Buttercup and Wesley, are finally reunited in a scene that Morgenstern does not include. Morgenstern interjects to mention that his wife was really upset at him not including this reunion scene, but he had his reasons. And then Bill cuts in to Morgenstern's interjection to first of all complain about how often Morgenstern mentions his wife, which is kind of a double-layered irony because Bill constantly does the same thing, and to complain about the missing reunion scene. In fact, Bill is so bothered by this missing reunion scene that he writes one of his own. However, because his publishers are very traditional, they won't let him include that newly written chapter in the book, because it's meant to be an abridgment and probably shouldn't contain original material. That's okay, whatever, annoying. Bill then provides his audience with an address and tells them to write a letter into that address requesting a copy of the scene. Then his publishers have agreed that if people send in letters, they will send individual copies of the scene to those people that wrote letters in. In a footnote on a footnote, then, in more modern editions, Bill has noted that there's now a website you can go to instead of going through all that fuss. Either way, once you get a hold of the missing scene, it is revealed that there were more copyright issues and that you still can't have access to that original scene. This is a joke, and it's a very funny joke, but it's also a really good way for Bill to get the audience onto his side. Whether or not you realize it, you are kind of annoyed about the publishers who won't just let him include this scene. It seems like he's kind of being harassed by them, and even though he is kind of feeling himself lighten and soften as he's getting into this story, so the audience is softening to him. Despite only including this character in a fictional frame narrative, Goldman does an excellent job of endearing Bill to his audience. Bill's personal storyline comes to a sort of head when they get to the part of the fairy tale in which Buttercup marries someone other than her true love, Wesley. Although it's later discovered to be a dream, as a kid, Bill had lashed out at his father, accusing him of reading the story to him wrong, and not wanting to upset his already ill child, and a bit put out by the accusation, Bill's father shuts the book and refuses to read anything else that night. Stewing over this kind of cosmic unfairness of Buttercup marrying someone else, Bill recounts, "Something was wrong, and I couldn't lose it. Suddenly there was this discontent, gnawing away until it had a place big enough to settle in, and then it curled up and stayed there, and it's still inside me, lurking as I write this now." The next night, when my father went back to reading and the marriage turned out to have been Buttercup's dream, I screamed, "I knew it! All along, I knew it!" And my father said, "So you're happy now. It's all right now. We can please continue?" And I said, "Go." And he did. But I wasn't happy. Oh, my ears were happy, I guess. My story sense was happy. My heart, too. But in my, I suppose you have to call it soul, there was that damn discontent shaking its dark head. As Bill explains, he would later realize that this was the very first time that he ever seriously encountered the idea that life isn't fair. And although it was a bitter pill to swallow, learning this lesson early on so beautifully from the story and from his father's telling of the story equipped him very well to deal with the real world. This message continues for the rest of the story, and the tale gets a bit of a non-traditional conclusion. Although things may be happily ever after for now, they may not be forever. That doesn't mean I think they had a happy ending either, because in my opinion anyway, they squabbled a lot, and Buttercup lost her looks eventually, and one day Fezzik lost a fight, and some hotshot kid whipped Inigo with a sword, and Wesley was never able to really sleep sound because of Humperdinck maybe being on the trail. I'm not trying to make this a downer, understand? I mean, I really do think that love is the best thing in the world except for cough drops. But I also have to say, for the umpty-umpth time, that life isn't fair. It's just fairer than death, is all. Neither Morgenstern, Bill's father, or Bill are particularly interested in lying to their audience. The Princess Bride is a kid's story, but it's a kid's story that gets to some really brutal truths at points, but it is made digestible because of who is telling the story. The Princess Bride isn't so much the fairy tale story that it's telling, the story comes from the way that it centers the role of the storyteller. The story is in how it's told, the parts you choose to tell, the story ideas that you decide to weave together, the relationship that you have with the person that you're telling the story to. In a later edition of the book, in a supposed introduction to what would have been a sequel to the book, but that's fictional, long story. Anyway, it's revealed that through the retelling of The Princess Bride, through the abridgment that he wrote, Bill was finally able to reconcile with his son, and now with his son as an adult, they're quite close. They were brought together not just by the power of stories, but by the transformative power of storytelling. And while the character of Bill and the larger context of the meta-narrative don't necessarily make it into the movie version of this story, they do preserve that core remarkably well. The film goes back to Bill's experience, showing us a kid who's homesick and being visited by his grandfather. While the kid is at first reluctant to spend time with his boring old sentimental grandfather when he could be playing video games, the grandfather is able to lure the child in with the power of storytelling. We get less interjections from the two, certainly less than Bill interjected, although the kid likewise protests when Buttercup marries not Wesley, but we can see the grandfather slowly winning his grandson over, and by the end the kid is fully engaged, his video games long forgotten. But what the movie excels at is that it really allows the story within the story, to pop. The book hangs really heavily off the meta-narrative. The narrative voice is kind of the thing that makes the story work. Goldman actually admitted that when it came to writing a novel like this, he was a bit lost. He had the ideas for it, he knew the big moments, the best bits, as it were, but he didn't have the connective tissue that turned that from being a series of fun ideas into being an actual novel. The revelation came when he had this idea of the meta-narrative, a device that would allow him to string these disparate ideas together into a cohesive novel. Now, the thing about a movie, as opposed to a novel, is that it doesn't require quite so much cohesiveness. A movie can cut away from a character and cut back to them 3 weeks later, and it's a quite established trope. A movie can rely on just a couple sentences of backstory, while not necessarily needing to get into the weeds of who this person is or how they got where they are. While a movie must, of course, be cohesive and well written, because of the limited runtime that a movie has, and because of the pace at which a story in a movie tends to move, a movie can, more so than a novel, get by on just the good bits. And the good bits of this movie have stood the test of time. There are so many iconic moments from this movie, scenes I was able to quote even when I personally barely remembered the plot of the movie. The tight budget of this film made for some brilliantly inventive staging and set choices, and the whole thing just feels like all of the best parts of a fairy tale adventure wrapped together. Although the book and movie tell similar but very, very different stories, I feel like both of them serve to act as a celebration of the differences in medium, of what makes these mediums great. They're a celebration of the art of storytelling itself. A book is able to deliver these complex frame narratives very well. These visual references and parentheses within parentheses and footnotes. A movie is able to get by on stringing together the very best bits while still packing a punch. As the author of both the book and the screenplay, Goldman knew very well what each of these mediums required from his story. And the end product, regardless of whether or not it's a faithful adaptation, makes for a very, very good movie. So that puts it on the other end of this axis. But some adaptations hinge entirely on fidelity to the source, and they are made all the stronger for it. And I don't think there's a better example of this than No Country for Old Men. Cormac McCarthy's No Country for Old Men is a masterclass neo-Western, and that uniquely positions it to make for a very good adaptation. While the Western genre has a strong connection to literature, it really found its footing and made its name in film. And Cormac McCarthy in the novel and the Coen brothers in the film adaptation were able to evoke Western standards while turning them on their heads. The characters in this story are almost the perfect archetypes for the Western genre. The young man in over his head, the roving villain, the old sheriff. But Llewellyn Moss, the younger man who's gotten himself into a bit of trouble, is a decidedly unheroic character that never really rises to a level of heroism because of his indecisiveness. The action begins when he comes across a drug deal gone wrong and picks up a briefcase containing $2.4 million. This isn't a choice he really actively makes. He just notes that that briefcase sitting there contains his entire life, more money than he could ever hope to make, and so he just takes it. It's like it's inevitable. And although he deals with the fallout from his choices competently, he never quite takes responsibility for the very important decision that he's made. The villain of this story, Anton Chigurh, also breaks this mold. Far from the lawless scoundrel, he is a villain that hinges entirely on his own self-imposed morality, his own amoral kind of rules. He views himself not as a self-made murderer, but as an agent of the whims of fate, delivering death to those unfortunate enough to be put in his path. The sheriff, Ed Bell, is the kind of man who would have played perfectly into a Western story some 40 years earlier. But now he's an old man, and he's learning that the world is moving on without him. While his father and his father's father had never needed to carry a gun as sheriff, the violence of the New West has reached a point where he's realizing that there might not be room for someone like him. The movie casts these characters perfectly. Tommy Lee Jones as Belle, Josh Brolin as Moss, and Javier Bardem plays Sugar with a chilling accuracy. They're a cast that could very well play out a solid traditional Western, but seeing them in this brutal anti-Western environment is just terrific. Both the novel and the movie open on a monologue, which both sets and deconstructs expectations, but they go about it in slightly different ways. Once again twisting genre conventions, McCarthy's text is bleak and unadorned. Simple, italicized text, no lush world building, no reveling in the desert, as so many Westerns have before it. This opening monologue concludes, "Somewhere out there is a true and living prophet of destruction, and I don't want to confront him. I know he's real. I have seen his work. I walked in front of those eyes once. I won't do it again. I won't push my chips forward and stand up to go out and meet him. I can't say that it's even what you're willing to do, because I always knew that you had to be willing to die to even do this job. That was always true. Not to sound glorious about it or nothing, but you do. If you ain't, they'll know it. They'll see it in a heartbeat. I think it is more like what you are willing to become. And I think a man would have to put his soul at hazard. And I won't do that. I think now that maybe I never would." This is a brutal denouncement of the world, a really grim way to start a novel, and a firm declaration that the values of the Old West are dead, and the people who follow those values, like Belle, are soon to follow. The movie has a slightly more nuanced approach. Taking advantage of film's ability to combine image and sound, this opening monologue is underscored with the standard Western imagery. Sunrises over the mountains, grass waving in the breeze, distant windmills. Belle's monologue, which draws from later in-book monologues to establish his character a bit more, also takes on a different tone. While he agrees that a man would have to put his soul at hazard to continue existing in the world, he concludes,
"You'd have to say, okay. I'll be part of this world."
This leaves a beat of openness. It begs the question, will Belle decide to live in this world? This tonal shift, paired with the more traditional visuals, do an excellent job of seducing the audience's expectations, soothing them into the standard fare of the Western, only to crush those expectations when the film really starts. After that introduction, both book and movie refuse to luxuriate in genre for genre's sake. McCarthy's iconic lack of punctuation leads to a very stripped-back narrative. He almost never allows us deeper insight into what the characters are thinking or feeling to pair with the dialogue. The audience is frustratingly left on the other side of the glass, able to watch and to listen, but never able to quite understand the fullness of why they are doing and saying what they're doing and saying. The movie manages to capture this style astonishingly well, especially in iconic scenes like Sugar's coin toss. The hitman, just escaped from arrest, comes to a gas station and, after a short conversation, tells the owner to call a flipped coin. This coin will decide whether or not he lives or dies, even if the man does not know that. This conversation is translated nearly word to word from the book, but the acting choices, the stunted editing perfectly communicate the closed-off, terse feeling of the book's dialogue. This is all accentuated by a genre-breaking silence. The entire film contains less than 20 minutes of soundtrack, and most of the soundtrack that is there is things like drones and long sustained notes, the humming of the same frequency of a refrigerator, slowly gnawing away at the corners of your mind, whether or not you're even hearing it. I'll be honest, on my first watch of this movie, I didn't realize that there was no soundtrack. I just didn't really clock it until I sat and thought about it later. All I could really catch while I was watching the film is this kind of closed-in, breathless feeling that you have through the whole thing. It's so odd for a movie not to have a soundtrack, but you don't notice it, and so when it's not there, it just feels off somehow. McCarthy's novel presents you with a story, and refuses to use any of the literary devices that he has in his grasp to tell you as the audience how to feel about the story he's telling. And the movie uses its tools to replicate this effect very, very well. No Country for Old Men also breaks genre convention by refusing to let setting be anything more than just a fact. The book does this by refusing to elaborate on its descriptions. It'll tell you where you are and what's there, but it, once again, doesn't tell you how to feel about it. Is the desert beautiful, enchanting, ominous, weary? The characters aren't going to tell you how they feel about that, and McCarthy isn't going to tell you, the reader, how to feel about that. There's a lot of traveling in the story, and while more traditionally you would get lush descriptions of every single place they go, in the book this is cut down to basically just a list of place names. You're just getting points on the map, these gates and bridges. You're not getting the significance of these places, you're just getting where they are. The movie gets this across quite effectively by using establishing shots when necessary, just to show us where we are, but other than that, they keep the camera tightly closed in on the characters. It results in a kind of unconscious claustrophobia, a reordering of the senses, and ultimately it just serves the anti-Western approach that they're taking. In one of the most devastating moments in the story, after this novel-long cat and mouse chase between Sugar and Moss, as Moss has the money that Sugar needs, Moss is killed. And the most brutal part of that is that we as the audience don't see it. What very traditionally would have been one of the biggest moments in the story, this confrontation between these two hugely important characters, a shootout at dawn on the corral, is rendered into a moment that we don't even get to see. There is absolutely no chance for satisfaction. This isn't a plot hole, they make it quite clear what happened, but in both the book and the movie, they refuse to give in to what the Western wants from its story. This is echoed in Belle's non-confrontation with Sugar. He is meters away from confronting the embodiment of all of his darkest fears, facing the man that he's been tracking the entire story, and Belle backs off. He retires. There's never a confrontation. It is the ultimate anti-Western act of very relatable and very realistic cowardice. The only change that I would call major from book to movie comes at the end of the story, and I would say it's a change that really just serves to enhance the philosophical questions that this story begs. After Moss's death, Sugar goes after Moss's wife, Carla Jean. After all, when Moss was alive, he did swear that he would go after her, and he's a man of his word. Just like before, Sugar offers Carla Jean a coin toss. If she calls it correctly, he will spare her. He is an agent of chance, and everyone deserves their chance to live. In the movie, Carla Jean refuses to bend to his will. She recognizes that he uses the excuse of chance. He uses his identity as the agent of randomness to shield himself from his actions. It's how he distances himself from the terrible things that he's done. And in the movie, Carla Jean will not have that. She insists that he does have a choice, and she becomes a martyr for this. The Carla Jean of the books makes a fascinatingly different choice. Call it. I won't do it. Yes, you will. Call it. God would not want me to do that. Of course he would. You should try to save yourself. Call it. This is your last chance. Heads, she said. He lifted his hand away. The coin was tails. I'm sorry. She didn't answer. Maybe it's for the best. She looked away. You make it like it was the coin, but you're the one. It could have gone either way. The coin didn't have no say. It was just you. Perhaps, but look at it this way. I got here the same way the coin did. For things at a common destination, there is a common path. Not always easy to see, but there. Do you understand? When I came into your life was over. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. This is the end. McCarthy's conclusion, while earning us the same result, utterly deflates the heroism of Carla Jean in the film. In the book, Carla Jean comes to realize that another act of heroism, another symbolic act of martyrdom, isn't going to cancel out Sugar's symbolic distancing of himself from his violence. It would make for a good story, sure, but she'd be a fool not to take a 50-50 chance to save her own life. While the heroic moment of the movie is so satisfying, McCarthy is intent on not giving us even that satisfaction, instead hammering home just how utterly futile it is to use chance, principles, or any other extraneous excuse to explain sheer human instinct. The end of both the book and the film manage to accomplish the same thing through different techniques. They both end with another monologue from Bell, as he describes a dream that he had, where he was riding in the mountains with his father, and his father rode on past him. But although his father was now gone, he knew that his father had the fire with him, and he assumes that wherever his father has gone ahead of him, he's started a fire there, and he's getting it warm to prepare for Bell's arrival. The book delivers this through plainly italicized monologue. The movie has Bell deliver it to his wife on one of the first days of his retirement. But both versions show, despite everything that we've just seen, how stubborn hope can be. For Bell, there may not be optimism, but there is a belief in possibility. Possibility that up ahead, all the way through the dark, there may be a light. No matter how bleak and unforgiving reality may seem, he still holds on to this kind of belief that he had instilled in him from his youth, that things could get better, that he might be able to catch up with the world, or that the world may not be quite as damned as it seems. But this is a McCarthy story, and so both the book and the movie end with the line,
And then I woke up.
"We can't really say if this dream represents reality, if Bell's hopes are misplaced or not, and the storyteller isn't interested in giving us a simple answer. The world around us is going to chew us up. Who can say whether it's better to sleepwalk through a world like that or not? But No Country for Old Men is representative of the way that medium does not dictate the quality of a story. Though different in thousands of different ways, the book and the movie manage to tell the same story very, very well. Honestly, I think that one of the major reasons that No Country for Old Men adapted so well into a movie is that it literally started out as a screenplay. McCarthy first wrote the story as a screenplay, but couldn't get it picked up to be made into a movie, and so he turned it into a novel, and just a few years later, it was bought to become a movie made by the Coen brothers. That's not to undercut how good of an adaptation this is, and how skillfully it is done, but the point should be noted that some stories just make for better and easier adapting than others. Through employing different tactics to get the same result, No Country for Old Men is proof that it's possible to make a film that is both very faithful and also a very good movie. That's why I think that any fair analysis of adaptation should contain a second axis of accuracy to the source material, faithfulness to the source material. But it should be noted that faithfulness or unfaithfulness do not equate to goodness and badness. It is simply a new metric through which to categorize the art of adaptation. After all, one of my personal all-time favorite adaptations is one that is considered very radical. Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire is one of those books that I adore, even while I recognize that it's not the best book ever written. This is a slight tangent, but I get annoyed when people try and say that, like, preference and quality are the same thing. I like a lot of really bad things, and there are a lot of really technically good things that I've read, watched, or, taken in that I haven't necessarily enjoyed. Now, that's not to say that Interview with the Vampire is a bad book. It's just far from perfect. That is all to say that the avenue through which this story went from being enjoyable but technically problematic to being genuinely enjoyable for me and also very, very good was the 2022 AMC's Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire TV adaptation. While it changed a lot of specific details, the TV adaptation does an excellent job of picking up the threads of the original book and its sequels and delivering on those threads in a much cleaner and more cohesive way than the book was able to do. Interview with the Vampire is a story about vampires, but it's actually more a story about humans, their morals, and how an individual survives within the societies that humans create. Taking on the format of an interview with a vampire, the titular vampire Louis de Pontulac recounts his experience as a societal outsider, his experience of being a vampire, and his stormy relationship with his vampiric maker, Lestat de Lioncourt. Through the rather untraditional family unit that he and Lestat become, and the tumultuous life and loss of their daughter Claudia, Interview with the Vampire explores themes of exclusion, difference, sexuality, gender, time, and the burden of existence. Now, the book, originally written in 1976, does kind of dance around a lot of these topics in a way that does tend to muddle them. Louis starts out his life as a slave-owning plantation owner in the Deep South, and Anne Rice draws some really interesting parallels between his existence as a vampire, preying on those with less power to him, and his role as a mortal, extorting others for his own gain. There are parallels drawn between the isolation that Louis experiences, being a man who's questioning his sexuality in a homophobic society, and his later experience as a socially outcast, amoral vampire. Family dynamics are explored through the curious vampiric family that Louis and Lestat create as they raise Claudia. Their family ties built out of desperation and loneliness, and constantly challenged by their troubled vampiric existence and social isolation. But while all of these ideas are prompted and these connections are suggested, I find that none of them are really explored to a point that I find satisfactory. And this is in part due to emotionally where Louis' character is during the interview. Louis is a chronically depressed, melodramatic, kind of miserable person. His whole thing is lamenting his terrible station in life and never actually doing anything to fix that existential angst. Thus, the comparison of vampirism to slave ownership is made, but never really confronted in a serious way. Louis is never seriously called to account for his immoral actions as a man or as an immortal. The connection between queerness and vampirism is implied, but again, never really fully explored, and it's kind of left hanging. In later books, Anne Rice would make these characters more explicitly queer, to the point where she literally wrote out a wedding for Lestat and Louis. However, I think that the fact that this book came out in the mid-70s did have an impact on how overt she wanted to be with Louis and Lestat's romance. She didn't want to alienate her audience, and so the queerness is kind of undertoned and undercut in a lot of ways. But in that first book, there's still a definite suggestion of a connection between vampirism, the act of being a murderous leech upon society, and being queer or gay. And this is one of those things where unless you explore this idea with a good deal of nuance, it can be taken in a very harmful way. So I think the fact that she suggested this idea in this first book, without going into it with the nuance that she would in later books, does detract from this idea working in the story. In terms of changing family dynamics, the book also seems to be a somewhat progressive look at how different family dynamics can work and how difficult it can be to have a different family dynamic functioning in a very traditional world. However, the book also suggests an incestuous attraction between Louis, who's in a father role, and his daughter, Claudia, who at the time of her changing was 5 years old and is still in the body of a 5-year-old, despite the fact that her mind has aged. And look, I get it, I've read other Gothic fiction. I am aware of the fact that incest is a very common theme that appears in a lot of Gothic fiction, and I'm not against the concept of discussing the taboo in the correct context, with the correct nuance and enough discussion. But when Anne Rice just makes these connections and doesn't further explore them in this book, it does muddle them, and it makes it difficult to parse out exactly what she was trying to say. In my opinion, these conflicting and often under-delivered themes from the first book are repaired by later books in the series. Nearly 10 years after the publication of Interview with the Vampire, the second book, The Vampire Lestat, came out. And although Louis is still a present character in this book and through the rest of the series, he's been taken out of the driver's seat and replaced with the far less melancholic, far more driven Lestat. For all of his very real flaws, Lestat is a protagonist who refuses to let things lie. He vigorously turns over complicated philosophical ideas. He is constantly striving to create some kind of moral code for himself, even as an inherently amoral creature. And I find that a lot of the congestion and confusion from that first book is cleared up through the explorations done in the later books. Of course, Lestat still kills people, and he does things that are worse than that. He's not a good person, but at the very least, he is a very active and engaged protagonist who's not just going to leave these questions unanswered in the same way that Louis did. Look, Interview with the Vampire, the first book, is definitely the most literary out of Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles books. After a little while, the books get weirder and do kind of go off the deep end at a certain point, but that's kind of the fun of it. While Interview with the Vampire is a fairly self-serious, intentionally philosophical novel, and thus it feels like the ball has been dropped when it refuses to engage deeper and more fully with these philosophical ideas, the later books are electric. The pace and tone are more light and engaging. The protagonists and narrators are given true narrative voices. And although Anne Rice doesn't claim to have all of the answers for these complicated philosophical questions that she's asking, she does confront them with far more honesty and transparency than she did in the first book. When it came to adapting this story for the 2022 AMC production, showrunner Roland Jones decided to take the approach of not just adapting the first book, but the whole series. This means that the show adopts the tone of the later books, more so than the first one, and this is all done through the device of it being a second interview. They explain that the first book, with its melancholic tone, its bitterness, and its squeamishness around more philosophical ideas, was actually the first interview that took place all the way back in the 70s. This way, that first book and all of its angst and all of its very important details are allowed to exist in this world without being the be-all and end-all of Louis de Pontellac's story. In the first book, the actual interview, the interviewer asking the questions, it was more of a textureless frame than an actual device used to push the narrative forward. The interviewer was basically just sitting there and saying, "And then what?" And although he enters the story a little bit towards the end, he does not play a particularly important role. The show explains this by pointing out that the interviewer from the original interview was very young and also very, very high at the time of that interview, and so he wasn't giving a particularly good interview. Louis was also in a very weird emotional place at the time, which explains the way he talked about Lestat and the rest of his life with such a vitriolic tone. But now in the present day, some 50 years later, Louis has asked the original interviewer, Daniel Malloy, to come back for a second try. And Daniel is no longer the toothless 20-year-old kid who is only asking leading questions. Now, with Louis in a less dark place and more willing to be honest about his past, and Daniel a fully grown journalist with teeth of his own, the second interview is going to play out far differently. The narrative voice, which becomes a huge tool in later books, is brought back into prominence in this first story. No longer is Louis a miserable, ranting existentialist. He is a man who's had time to go back through his memories and realize that not everything is there, and now he is on an earnest, truth-seeking journey. With Daniel there, prying for both a story and the truth, Louis' role as a mortal, extorting others for his own gain, is criticized as it should be. The irony of the fact that guilt drove him to go vegetarian as a vampire, refusing to eat humans, is made to compete with his willful extortion of those very humans back when he was a mortal. With time past and changing societal norms, Louis is now willing to openly admit to his queerness, and they're able to openly discuss the ways in which social exclusion due to his sexuality and the color of his skin made vampirism a very attractive prospect. The original interview, so the first book, paints Lestat as an unrepentant monster. He is the villain of that story. But as the later books come to reveal, and as they find out in this interview in the show, he really is a deeply wounded person. His behavior is still monstrous, but you can tell that he is abusing as he was once abused. They don't forgive his behavior by any account, but they make room for the ways in which hurt people tend to hurt people. They pick at questions of trauma, of cyclical abuse, and the way in which our own history of hurt and of harm can shape the ways that we act today. In the second interview, Claudia's character is able to speak freely and with her own voice through her diaries, which Daniel is able to read. Free from Louis' rose-colored nostalgia, we see Claudia going through her own tortuous, joyful, terrible, beautifully powerful vampiric existence. She's made a character beyond just being a pawn in her father's tempestuous romance. Although it is still not claiming to have the answers to life, the universe, and everything, the show confronts the ideas and philosophies of Interview with the Vampire far more straightforwardly and transparently, in a similar way to how Anne Rice did in the later books. But the creators of the show don't just want this interview to be a useful meta-narrative. The plot that's occurring in the current day as the interview is proceeding is mostly invented, but it does a really good job of picking apart and emphasizing themes from the first book while leading into themes and plot points in the later books. At the end of season 1, it's revealed that Louis' silent assistant, Rashid, is actually Armand, Louis' lover from the second half of the Interview with the Vampire book. While in the book, his relationship with Armand kind of ends up on the back burner, it's a brief obsession that kind of peters out as they're both consumed with misery and existentialism. In the show, Armand is made a much more active and engaged character, and because his relationship with Louis is ongoing when we meet him, we get to see a lot more of their relationship dynamic play out. In one of my favorite episodes of television ever, Louis and Daniel sit down without Armand to reminisce about the first interview that they did together. More specifically, how it ended. According to both of their memories, it ended when Daniel unwisely asked to become a vampire, Louis attacked him for this, and then Armand saved Daniel, and then they sent Daniel off to a drug den to sleep it off, and he woke up not really remembering what had happened, thinking that it was all drugs. But as Daniel and Louis backtrack through their memories and begin putting things together, they're starting to realize that Armand may have been much more involved than they thought. When Armand came to save Daniel, it's actually because he was upset that Louis was draining another drug fiend after talking to him about Lestat all night, and Louis and Armand have this blowout fight that ends with Louis attempting to end his life. While nursing Louis back to health, Armand tortured Daniel for days, driven by hate, jealousy, and fascination. They finally wiped Daniel's memories and sent him off to the drug den, as he recalled. But what Louis had forgotten is that Armand also wiped his memories, in an ongoing effort to keep Louis content and happy in their relationship. This revelation is a domino effect to more and more realizations, and by the end of season 2, Daniel is able to reveal the extent of Armand's deception. Contrary to what Louis had been told, Armand was actually quite complicit in the trial and execution of Louis' daughter Claudia, and it turns out that Lestat had been the one to save Louis from the execution rather than Armand. Armand had just taken credit when the opportunity arose, and he has been lying to Louis and hiding more to hide that lie for 70 years. This is Louis's breaking point, and he ends his relationship with Armand and goes off to find some kind of reconciliation with Lestat, who, although he's not willing to get back together with him yet, he's realizing that the two of them may have a lot more in common than he was ever willing to admit before. The second season manages to land the jump of ending up roughly where the end of the first book did. By the end of season 2, Armand and Louis are split up, and Lestat and Louis are theoretically talking again. However, in the book, Louis finds out about Armand's killing Claudia way earlier. He kind of finds out about it immediately, but he just forgives him. And then their relationship eventually peters out because of Louis' existential misery, and Lestat just leaves him. And he does go and talk to Lestat to kind of set the record straight, but he finds Lestat as miserable and listless as him and kind of abandons him to die in New Orleans. Now, the really bleak dissatisfaction that occurs at the end of the Interview with the Vampire book is kind of a feature, and I really like that ending of the book. It is bitingly dissatisfying, kind of similar to the painful dissatisfaction you get from No Country for Old Men. However, it does mean that Louis is almost necessarily a really weak and watered down character. He really isn't that likable, and as an effect from that, he kind of fades from prominence in the later books. He's always involved with Lestat, because he and Lestat are together forever, but he doesn't really stay a main character. Much like Daniel, who was the interviewer in the first book, and then has a brief romance with Armand in the third book, but then is also written off because Anne Rice found him boring, she had a tendency to write characters that were a little bit weak, and then abandon them in favor for stronger characters that she preferred, like Lestat and like Armand. But the show was not willing to include intentionally weak characters. Although Louis is still deeply flawed in the show, he becomes genuinely likable and compelling through a great combination of a charming actor and a really great script. He's still struggling and he is still melancholic, but by giving him some agency at the end of season 2 or book 1, they reinforce and strengthen his character a lot and set him up for much more success in the later books. He made the choice to leave Armand. He made the choice to reconcile with Lestat. And by the end of season 2, he is on the way to becoming a much stronger character. But the frame narrative and the new setting of the present day is not the only major change that has been made. The time period has been moved up, and Louis' occupation and race have changed. In the show, which takes place in 1910s New Orleans, Louis is a black brothel owner. This is a very significant change with huge ramifications that the show creators had play out very realistically. The timeline had to be condensed so that that part of the story was taking place in the 1900s rather than in the 1800s as it originally was, but it gives them a chance to explore a whole new range of things, both fun and terrible. Now we are in the jazz age, watching that play out. We also see the ramifications of the Second World War on the vampiric homeland. This also puts them all on the precipice of a lot of change, changing rights for women, gay people, and people of color. It is a significant change, but it is a change that allows for so many conversations and new themes to be opened up from this older story. They do manage to maintain the thread. As a brothel owner, Louis is still exploiting people for his own gain, and so that conversation is able to happen, but they avoid the trickiness that arises from creating a character who's a protagonist, who we are meant to sympathize with, and in some way relate to, who is also a slave owner. And we can discuss the nuance in another video of specifically why they made that change, but I do understand on modern TV why they would not want to be pushing forward and platforming someone who owned slaves as their protagonist. By making Louis and Claudia black themselves, they were able to explore a whole new range of dynamics for these characters. Louis is no longer just a non-straight man, he's also being excluded from society due to his race, and the question of race and the vampire is a whole bucket of worms that modern entertainment has only just begun to explore with vigor. By including non-white characters in these roles, which in the original novel were white, they're able to explore a whole new texture of history, a whole new experience of what someone going through these times, even as a vampire, would have experienced. And yes, it absolutely is a change, but it is a change that means that they can have more interesting conversations. This is a radical adaptation. It takes a lot of liberties and it makes a lot of changes. And whether or not you like those changes and you want to see the story taken in that direction is entirely up to personal taste. But the reality is that it doesn't make it a bad adaptation. If you want to go back and read the books are right there and you can read them in their original form. And if you want to see a really faithful adaptation, the movie from the 90s exists. Even if it is a somewhat more muted approach to the story in a lot of ways, it is still a fairly faithful adaptation. So that exists. But the show wasn't trying to be a perfectly faithful adaptation.
So why are we reimagining this story? Well, I think, like any great piece of art, every generation or every few generations wants to reckon with it in a new way. And
this show is very different to the books. It is unfaithful in many ways, but in the ways that it is able to take this source material and transform it, reshape it, introduce new voices to it, while still maintaining many of the core thematic threads of the original book, it's downright miraculous, or at the very least, very skillful artistic adaptation. And in their defense, despite the radical changes made, they managed to integrate a lot of scenes from the original book. In one of my favorite scenes from both the book and the show, Louis and Armand are sitting and having a philosophical conversation about the nature of evil, and whether or not one sin can forever alter your quality of being good or bad. And in the book, it's a simple back and forth between the two. But the show sets this scene in a smoky, swanky cafe in downtown Paris, and it's punched up by cameos from famous philosophers and the ever-present ghost of Lestat. They also integrate a lot of the best monologues from the book, the most iconic ones, such as Louis' observations about how the endless endurance of the vampiric life is like a clock ticking in a void that nobody hears. They put it into the mouth of a different character, and they do give it a different context of it being a monologue that someone is saying in a stage play, but they still get it in there, and it's really fun touches like that that make this show so much fun to enjoy as someone who also enjoyed the book, despite its inaccuracies. And they also take some scenes from the book, but elaborate them beautifully. In the book, Louis describes his vampiric transformation. I forgot myself totally, and in the same instant knew totally the meaning of possibility. From then on, I experienced only increasing wonder, as Lestat talked to me and told me of what I might become, of what his life had been and stood to be. My past shrank to embers. I saw my life as if I stood apart from it. In the book, we never actually learn what it is that Lestat says to Louis. We just get the general description of the energy of what he was saying. But the show puts this idea to words in such an enchanting scene. It is heartbreakingly romantic and brutal, as Lestat begs for Louis to embrace who he truly is through vampirism, while they kneel in a pool of blood at the altar. The fact is that the new Interview with the Vampire show is a radical adaptation, but it's also just a really good show. The writing is top-notch, the music is incredibly compelling, the visuals from hair, makeup, scenery, props, the locations, all of it is so perfect. The cast is one of the best casts I've seen. It includes a lot of actors who have not seen the big screen before, and they do an incredible job, and it does not hurt that they are some of the most ethereally, beautifully vampiric people that I have seen in my entire life. This is all to say that this is my formal plea to anyone who knows anyone at AMC to please invite me to the season premiere for the show, the season 3 premiere. I can be in New York in 90 minutes flat. You just say the word and I'm there. I'll be really quiet, I'll be really nice. I just need more of this show like I need air. So please, I am not above begging. Okay, I'm done begging now. The point is that this show is unequivocally, unapologetically not very accurate to the source material. But to me, that begs the question, is that a bad thing? At its very most basic level, you can kind of call every story ever told an adaptation of one sort or another. Our mythologies were an attempt to adapt the natural phenomena we saw around us into human stories. A la Tolkien's Cauldron of Story, every story is made up of the butchered and desiccated remains of the stories that came before it. Originality is just kind of something we aspire to, but never will really be able to reach. If you think about it, even Shakespeare was basically writing his own fan fiction of stories and histories that came before him. But all of these things aren't really called out as being an adaptation, and they are not critiqued on the basis of fidelity critique. They are not being compared and contrasted to the source material. In all actuality, the modern concept of adaptation arose in the mid to late 1700s, along with the Romantic era, that is, romantic with a capital R. And this all got its start with the dawn of the printing press, when suddenly stories were more widely available and more profitable than ever before, and they needed to be regulated. And early copyright law is pretty messy, but a lot of the times printers would be granted perpetual common law copyright, which means that they were the only ones who could publish a story in perpetuity for the rest of time. And as we can see in the here and now with Disney, this has a very choking out effect on stories. Copyright can be a very limiting thing. In 1774, British legislation was passed that ended perpetual common law copyright. And suddenly, there was an explosion of retellings, restagings, and adaptations of older stories. Now, context is key here, because all of this was going down during the Romantic period with a capital R, when people were just beginning to start to look closer at the type of art that they consumed. Romanticism tended to have an implicit bias against popular media, and it pushed forward the purity and supremacy of literature as the ultimate art form. And so they were naturally going to be at odds with this new adaptational media that was occurring. It was popular, people liked it, and it generally wasn't literature. A lot of the times in this period, it was people adapting books into plays or performed media. Thus it was in 1796 that we get what Glenn Jelinek calls the first true adaptational phenomena, the Iron Chest. Based on the novel Things as They Are by William Godwin, this play was a 4-hour adaptation that was not very good. The details as to why aren't particularly important for our purposes. More or less, the book was a really highly political and philosophical novel, whereas the play was just kind of adapting the events rather than the philosophy behind it, and it was very boring. And also there was a public feud between the lead actor and the writer, but the gist of it is that it wasn't very good, and it got popular for being not very good, specifically as an adaptation. Critics tore apart not just the quality of the play, but its faithfulness to the source text as well. Not only was it not as good as the book, but they were viewing deviations from that source material as a desecration of that source material. From its very inception, the bad adaptation was viewed as a moral wrong, a sullying and a degradation of the more pure and more holy original source text. And this change in the critical language is what marks the Iron Chest as the first true modern adaptation. What marks the Iron Chest as the birth of a simple abstraction was the public and critical reception of Coleman's work. In other words, the modern concept of adaptation is a critical rather than an artistic construction. The adaptation's existence, as such, depends not on the artist's production, but rather on the audience's reception. Since we first began critiquing adaptations, we have viewed deviations from the source material as a definitively bad thing. This is called fidelity critique, and it is a trap that so much adaptational critique falls into. And despite the fact that it's been dismantled, or people have been trying to dismantle this For years, it remains a very prevalent idea. And in our modern culture, this is only worsened by how many clicks fidelity critiques generate. Listicles and Quizlets and video essays comparing a movie to its novel, slideshows contrasting movie costumes to comic character designs. Sometimes it feels like fidelity criticism is all that people want to hear. And while I do obviously think that fidelity criticism has a place, and that like the concept of fidelity analysis should be engaged in, I think it's worth dismantling why it seems like that's all we talk about when it comes to adaptations. Why is it that we view the source material as this untouchable bastion of good storytelling that the unworthy adaptation can only sully with its unfaithful choices? Well, I do think it comes down to the fact that a lot of people think that literature, books, novels, is just the right way to tell a story. That is the best way that one can possibly tell a story. And this might be controversial, but that's not true. Everyone can have preferences, of course, and every different medium has its own strengths and weaknesses, but no one method of story conveying is better at telling stories than any other, and I will die on this hill. Now we can go through a bunch of points. Yes, a movie pushes you through a story much faster than a book does, but a book you might get distracted from because you can put it down, it'll take you 3 months to read, whereas a movie can sweep you away into its adventure. Yes, a book is a more private viewing experience than a movie. If you're gonna go see a movie in theaters, you're with 60 people. If you're reading a book, you're alone. But that doesn't necessarily make it a better storytelling experience. We have been gasping at stories and screaming and crying in a group together over a story for much longer than we have been sitting in a room quietly reading a book. You can argue that a book has one authorial voice, whereas a movie requires multiple, but you could also then argue that a movie involves collaboration, which means that it's possible for you to get a bunch of minds together and use the best parts of all of those minds to create a single product, whereas a book is just one author's best part of their mind. My point is that movies are not an inherently worse device with which to deliver a story compared to books. So why is that idea so prevalent? Well, there is the fact that movies tend to be much more public failures than books. There are millions and millions of really, really bad books published every year. However, movies tend to be more expensive and involve a lot more people, so when there is a movie that flops, it's going to get much more eyes on it than a book written by somebody with no editor who printed 6 copies and no one ever read a single one of those. There's also the fact that literature has just been around longer than movies have. So literature has had years to refine itself. We look back on literary history and see these massively popular, incredibly written classics of literature, but because we're only seeing the best of the best when we look back through the historical record, we're disregarding, again, the millions and millions of really, really bad stories that are written down every single year throughout all of history. You know, it's all very similar to how novels used to be viewed as a degradation of the great craft of writing. They're the kind of things that are gonna rot the brains of the youths. Nothing really changes. But this incredibly pervasive idea has caused a bias against films as just an inferior form of media. And this has huge ramifications on the way that we view adaptations, and it has huge ramifications on the way that we view the source texts that have been adapted from. As Thomas Leach explains, an adaptation is assumed to be a window into a text on which it depends for its authority, and the business of viewers and analysts is to look through the window for signs of the original text. But texts themselves are assumed to be not windows, but paintings that invite readers to look at or into them rather than through them. Although it is certainly true that adaptations are intertexts, it is equally true that their precursors are intertexts, because every text is an intertext that depends for its interpretation on shared assumptions about language, culture, narrative, and other presentational conventions. The idea of the story as a singular, crystallized entity is a relatively newfangled idea that we've kind of just fooled ourselves into believing. The printing press made it all too alluring to view stories as something in stasis, the single canonical text that cannot change. But this is kind of foolish. If I sit down and read a 10-page story, and then I come back 15 minutes later and I read the same story, my experience of reading it the second time is not going to be the same as my experience of reading it the first time. It has in some way adapted to its new conditions. The things I might have heard in the last 15 minutes, the way that I was changed by my first time reading it. Stories are never the same, and by picking them up off the page and putting them into our minds, they undergo a transformation, a form of adaptation. A story can quote dialogue, it can write out names, it can name specific colors, but it is the human mind that gives those lines of dialogue a voice, that creates a face to go behind the name, that knows what the color of the sky means. Adaptation, telling a story in a new voice, for a new audience, with a new medium, is the act that keeps stories alive in a culture. When it comes to how I view adaptational critique, this is a fair explanation, if not simplified, to how I tend to look at these things. Because, yeah, of course, faithfulness and unfaithfulness do not equate to goodness or badness, but there's 1,000 different other metrics that you can measure a story. Critique and analysis are very tricky things, and they are things that deserve thought. A lot of adaptational critique is kind of stunted because it limits itself to case studies, to taking one adaptation of one source material and figuring out, is it good, is it bad, is it faithful, or is it unfaithful? The reason that I decided to make this video about 4 different adaptations is not just because I like to yap, although that is of course a factor. It's because different adaptations require different analytical tools. And if we limit ourselves to singular case studies, to applying our tools to just one singular story, we lose out on critiquing the concept of adaptational critique itself, a field that does deserve careful thought and consideration. When we rip a story apart just because it deviates from the source material, we are ignoring the fact that the source material itself is something that may deserve critique, and yes, it may even deserve changing. Of course, I'm not going to try and say that every really unfaithful adaptation is actually a radical restyling of the book and it's a good thing. A really bad adaptation does have the capacity to change the way that the original source material is looked back on, and that can be a very harmful thing. But if we limit ourselves to just critiquing something unfaithful versus unfaithful, I think that we are losing a lot of the conversation around what an adaptation can and should be. I do wish that we could kind of shift the conversation away from something being a good adaptation versus a bad adaptation just to considering whether or not something is a good story. We should be creating stories that use every tool available to us to their fullest extent. Stories that dive beautifully and completely into what they are trying to say and do. Stories that say things that the storytellers feel like need to be said. I often hear people complain about how all that gets made these days is adaptations, and I'm on board with that. I also find it frustrating, and I wish that it wasn't so financially feasible to just keep retelling the same 6 stories over and over again, to keep, using people's nostalgia to extort money from them. But it's worth remembering that just because something is an adaptation, that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, and deviation from the source text also is not a negative thing. After all, adaptation really is just how we look at something. It is an analytical tool, and just as every artistic tool, it can be used well and it can be used badly. I know very well that I do not personally have the capacity to change the way in which media is discussed on the internet. Hate generates clicks and probably always will, the algorithm is inscrutable and foul, and fidelity critique is inescapable and has been for about 300 years. But I do hope that as more artists take flexible, creative, and well-considered looks into what adaptation is capable of, that the term adaptation can stop sounding like a bad word. I'm very, very proud of this diagram that I thought up because in my opinion, most media lands somewhere on there. So let me know in the comments where your favorite or least favorite adaptation lands on this particular graph, because I find the ones that are really faithful but really bad to be interesting, and the ones that are really unfaithful but are really good to be interesting. So let me know how you critique your adaptational media and what some of your favorite adaptations are down in the comments below. Do give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and consider sharing it with a friend who enjoys any one of the stories that I talked about, and also do consider subscribing if you want to tune in almost every week to hear me talk about the art of storytelling, media, and The Lord of the Rings, and the other stuff that I like to talk about. Thank you so much for joining me this week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hoppity day.